Well, welcome to the show, Douglas. Thanks for being here this evening with me. This is a bonus episode for all the listeners. And so, Douglas, why don't you go ahead and tell everybody who you are?
My name's Douglas Ray, and I live in Bellingham, Washington. I work as an educator, and in my spare time, I run a tiny little business called RopeLite, where we make custom splice gear for climbers and ski mountaineers and canyoneers and other people who use ropes.
Very cool. And what kind of educator are you?
Uh, that's a long answer because I work in the Bellingham School District, specifically focused on kids with significant behavior
Mhm.
challenges. And if you want the full explanation, it would take the whole episode.
Okay. Well, thanks for being an educator. That's important work. So,
Mhm.
you said you started a small little company called RopeLite, and that's why you reached out to me initially, right? Because you listened to the last episode, the December 1st episode, and then you emailed me. So let's talk about that.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and actually, you said you wanted to hear why I started RopeLite. I started RopeLite actually because I'm a part of Bellingham Mountain Rescue. And initially, I was just unhappy with some of the equipment we had, specifically our litter bridle. And I went on this journey of trying to figure out how to make one that was smaller and lighter. And I used to splice things when I was a kid because spent time on sailboats. And so I made a spliced litter bridle for our Bellingham Mountain Rescue. And I figured out that with this technology, I could make all sorts of things. And I started fiddling around and making things and the things that I used. And my friends started telling me, Doug, you got to start a business with this stuff. You got to sell these things. And I wasn't very interested in that for a long time. But then at some point, I had come up with a few things I thought were pretty good, and I was like, the only way that these would ever be out there is if I make them and sell them.
Hmm. What's
So,
splicing?
so splicing is a way of securing rope and cordage that is there's many different varieties, but essentially you take it somewhat apart and reassemble it in a different configuration. So to make a loop in the end, instead of tie it in a knot, you somehow open up the weave of the rope and then put it back together. And so splicing retains much more strength in ropes than tying knots.
That's
And
very
that's a
interesting.
lot of the advantage if you're trying to save weight. You can use a smaller cord because you can keep a lot more of the strength.
And you do testing on your own equipment?
Hmm. Yeah, I have a test set up. I have to go set it up between trees, so it's a very seasonal device. But I do brake test a lot of things. I started as process testing at some other local businesses that have equipment, and then I bought my own stuff. And I try to test. Like I invented a splice, and that I called a snake splice. And with that, there's two versions. There's an eye splice and there's a loop that I make out of it. And each of those, after I got the thing that worked the way I wanted it to work, I had to go break five of them in each cordage size to make sure, because that's as close as I can tell to what like UIAA testing standards are. That you test five samples of something to decide how strong it is.
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, thanks for your work with search and rescue too. That's also very challenging work mentally, emotionally, and
Mhm.
physically. So thanks for that. Um,
Yeah.
that's like like I was saying at the beginning, like that's sort of how you and I even started talking with each other because you listened to the last episode, the December 1st episode of the guy who got he fell into a snow bridge collapsed as he was skiing down, and then two guys came upon him and then rescued him. So, what tell us
Mhm.
about your side of the story of all that?
Well, my side of the story was, so this past spring, this was a day when I'd been out, like the weather was nice, and I'd gone rock climbing, and I was on my way back, and then this call out comes out, and there was a part of me that was very frustrated because I was away and I had to get home before I could respond.
Because that's where your gear
But
is
it was,
stored. You had to like go back and get your search and rescue gear.
well, yes, and there was like my search and rescue gear was at home. I was quite a ways away rock climbing without that gear. And our initial response was going to be probably to try to get a team to the airport, which would have been the opposite direction from where I was from.
Mm.
Like I would have to go past my house to the airport. So I got in as a late comer to the response. Like I got home and packed stuff and then called somebody, and I looked over the information that was there, and they're like, "Well, we have a team that's at the airport. We're trying to get a helicopter to pick them up and fly them up there. We have another team that's on its way to, we're trying to get snowmobiles to take them up on the other side of the mountain." And I was like, "Well, if you need any more people, let me know." And then a half hour later, we got the stand down that he was out of the crevasse
Mhm.
and had been rescued.
Mhm.
But I a lot of why I started RopeLite was that I had come up with these little friction hitches that work on these tiny little ropes we like to take on glaciers, and they commented in your episode that like our Prussics didn't work very well, and I was like, you should have the Prussics I came up with, and you shouldn't have to buy them. You obviously are the people who need them.
Mhm.
So I reached out because I wanted to give those guys better tools if they ever have to do this again.
That you make.
Hmm.
And so why, they did make that comment, but can you explain to the listeners who aren't into glacier travel, glacier mountaineering, that type of world, why would a normal prusik or a larger diameter prusik not work on a skinny rope?
Okay. So what we're talking about in terms of a prusik is it's in the category what you call a friction hitch. And so you tie something around a rope, and the purpose of that something is that when you put tension on it, it's going to grip the rope with friction and hold. And so pretty much all friction hitches usually are tied with smaller rope. Well, yeah, there's the host rope, and then there's what we call the hitch cord or the prusik loop. And so with most of the cordage we use climbing, we really need quite a bit of size difference between the host rope and the hitch cord or prusik loop that we're using. And there's a lot of other factors that affect that, which notably how soft or stiff the prusik cord is.
Or wet and or dry?
Yes, so it's one of those like for whatever. So most people, so common things use 9 millimeter climbing rope, use 6 millimeter cord to make prusiks and friction hitches, and that will generally work. And if you get it wet, it doesn't work as well, but it still kind of will. But when you get down to 8 millimeter host rope, it starts to not work as well with that 6 millimeter cord. And so you can get yourself chasing in this little circle of smaller cord, and the smaller cord is weaker. And so when you get down to a host rope, which is 6 millimeter, like Petzl Rad line, like Mammut Glacier line, that kind of thing, you would be looking in normal cordage world for like a 3.5 or 4 millimeter cord, but those aren't really very strong.
Mhm.
And so one of the things I learned, because I started messing with all these other marine cordages in my business, and I found some that are just really, really soft. And they deform a lot when they're used as a friction hitch. And so I found this hollow braid 5 millimeter cord that works fine. A 3-wrap prusik on that. On dry material will hold. I tested 5 of those to the first slip by tensioning them, and they've held between 2.2 and 2.8 kilonewtons.
You're really into
Yeah.
this.
Yes. I mean, I wouldn't have started this weird hobby business if I wasn't super nerdy about it.
When did you start RopeLite?
In July.
Oh, so it's new.
Yes, it's not quite 6 months old.
Oh my gosh. Well, happy nearly 6-month birthday. And
Thank you.
okay, and so did the guys from December 1st episode, did they reply back to you?
So Dave got a hold of me, and I sent him some stuff.
Mhm.
He's an example of the kind of person that I really like to talk to about this, because he is a ski mountaineer, but he's also like an arborist and a rope access technician. And in my own work with search and rescue, and in my own like crevasse rescue stuff, like I start to use all these techniques from both arborism and rope access, actually. And so I hope he and I'll get a chance to sit down and chat at some point about all of that.
Very cool. Do you have any of your equipment that you can show the listeners that are watching on YouTube?
Oh, I have all sorts of stuff. I actually was just making stuff because I knew you would ask.
Am I that predictable?
Well, you said, "Hey, can you do it tonight?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Oh shoot, I sent away the last of my samples of micro prusiks." So this is the little prusik that works on 6 millimeter ropes. really well. And this is the smallest one that would probably work. It's the 22 centimeter loop. And this is what most people usually order. This is about a 30 centimeter loop. And this spliced section in the middle, this is the snake splice that I came up with. And its big thing is it's a lot shorter than other splices. Splices usually take up an awful lot of rope. So this is much shorter. But unlike sewn things, one of the things people comment is like, this is all soft and flexible. And so like you can take this thing and like twist it up really small and put it on a carabiner. And some people really like that.
Yeah, no dangles.
No, nothing really dangles off of that. And then another thing that I make, this was a big project for search and rescue that no search and rescue has bought. Like these are anchor slings, and these are 6mm Dyneema anchor slings that are 36 kilonewton material. And but this is what like deep bury splices look like. Like this is the spliced part of the rope. And as you can see, there's nothing that like grabs or bumps or whatever, and you can tie knots in this anywhere.
So what
So
would a
there's no
search and
little hard
rescue
spot.
team use that for?
Well, so what I was working on this, because in our search and rescue world, we need to build anchors that are at least 20 kilonewtons, and we're always in a hurry. And so we mostly build anchors two ways. We mostly build them by slinging trees or by equalizing a whole bunch of stuff buried in the snow. That's kind of what we end up doing. And so this device, it has loops in the ends, and it's strong enough that you can, well, this is called choker configuration in the logging world, but you can do this around a tree and it's still like 27 kilonewtons ish. And you can use it like a cordelette and tie knots in it and end up with 12 kilonewtons per strand, which is as strong as any of the things you're clipping it to. And you can hitch them together. That was one of the big things I wanted. If they're not long enough, you can do this with them. And because these end loops have twice as much material as this, so it's like this single strand is 36 kilonewtons. So you have like two 36 kilonewton strands, and then this weakens it a lot, but you still end up with about 30 kilonewtons at this connection. So these are stupidly strong, and they're not very heavy. Haven't sold any of those.
Well, hopefully we can get some sold for you, because I know a lot of search and rescue personnel listen to this show, and if you are rating your gear and testing your gear, and it's and tried and true from your search and rescue team in Washington, I don't see why you wouldn't maybe get some sales. Hopefully, I hope.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, the one that's turned out to be popular, this is a version made out of 5mm 22 kilonewton cord, and canyoneers love this thing. And these are very light, and they don't absorb water, which canyoneers really like.
And what's your favorite piece of equipment? What's your bread and butter?
Well, my bread and butter. So the thing that sells all the time is the micro pressing and the micro hitch cord. I think the thing that I like using the most are those lighter anchor slings. Like I made my first prototype. I did some testing at a local business, and I made one, and I took it climbing, and I was like, this thing is actually just really, really easy to use all the time. And so I've used it a lot. And I think the coolest thing I make are litter bridles, and they're the most esoteric, and I don't know if I'm ever going to sell another one. but actually I have one here, and I'm not going to try to show because I don't have a litter, but people who are in search and rescue are familiar with litter bridles will realize how little this is.
Very cool.
The litter bridle that we had when I started were 24 ounces. And when I finished designing and making one out of the spliced material, a spliced polyester, not like high tenacity fiber, it ended up being less than 8 ounces.
Oh my gosh.
And
That's
that
a
was
third
one of those
of the weight.
Yeah, and that was a part of the light bulb going on for me of like, oh, I could actually make things that are like a lot lighter than most of the other things I use.
Wow. Well, that's really impressive. Well, thank you for your enthusiasm for education, search and rescue, and RopeLite and gear. Like that's just you're making the world a better, faster place, a lighter place. So what's your website?
My website is ropelitellc.com.
Okay, and you're taking sales, so you are selling gear.
Taking
Uh-huh.
sales. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for chatting with me for these few minutes, and yeah, I really appreciate your time, and thanks for listening to the show, and thanks for hooking those guys up from the December 1st episode with your gear because it seems like they are literally the guys for that type of equipment.
Oh yeah. Well, and they're also like, like in our search and rescue world, we were several hours behind just from all of the administrative drag. And so bystanders going and getting people out of crevasses is really the thing that needed to happen right then. And I'm really glad that it did.
Yeah, me too. And so is the guy that got pulled out of the hole.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you want to share with us, Douglas?
Um, I mean, I could wax lyrical about glacier travel and crevasse rescue and like all sorts of things, but that probably is a pretty good summary of what the deal is.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.